These chilling stories will make you question reality. But the real question is, will you make it to the end? Let's find out. When I was 22, I moved into the basement apartment of my childhood home. It was my way of saving money while still having some independence. My parents traveled often, so I thought I'd have plenty of privacy. But I was wrong. The apartment was separated from the main house by a locked door at the top of the stairwell. It had an open layout, tiny kitchen connected to the living room, a hallway leading to my bedroom, a bathroom, and a laundry room. There was also a side entrance from the outside. At first, everything seemed fine, but one night, something happened that made me question if I was really alone down there. It was the perfect weekend. My parents were out of town, which meant I had the whole place to myself. No rules, no interruptions, just me, my friends, and a night to unwind. I invited my buddies, Ryan and Jake, over for drinks and a hockey game. The music was blasting, the drinks were flowing, and by the end of the game I had a nice buzz going. Not wasted, but definitely feeling it. Since my parents' fridge upstairs was bigger and way more convenient, I kept the drinks there. And with them gone, I never bothered locking the door between my basement apartment and the main house. It was just easier that way. By the time the night wound down, Ryan and Jake were too drunk to drive, so they decided to crash on my massive couch. It could easily fit 3 people if needed, so space wasn't an issue. We called it a night and I headed to my room, shutting the door behind me. A few hours later, something woke me up. Footsteps. I lay there in the dark, listening. Someone was walking around upstairs. My first thought? Probably Ryan or Jake grabbing water from the fridge. No big deal. I closed my eyes, ready to drift back to sleep. Then I heard it, my bedroom doorknob twisting. It was locked. It always was, a habit of mine. The knob jiggled again, just for a second, then stopped. I frowned. Why would either of them need to come in here? I was too tired to ask. Instead, I stayed silent, pretending I was still asleep. And after a few moments, the doorknob stilled. I fell back asleep. The next morning, Ryan was gone. Jake was still sprawled out on the couch. When he finally woke up, rubbing his eyes, I asked, "Did you try coming into my room last night?" Jake, "Huh? No, I don't think so. But man, I was pretty drunk." I let it go. We grabbed breakfast at a nearby deli, ate in my backyard, and Jake left soon after. I didn't even bother asking Ryan. I figured it didn't really matter. That night, I got home late. No drinking this time, just a long, exhausting day with other friends. I was wiped out. After a quick snack and a shower, I climbed into bed and watched TV for a while before shutting it off. Then, the noises started again. At first it was faint, small creaks, a few soft thumps. But then, directly above me in the kitchen, footsteps. I sat up, my heart pounding. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling. My mind was playing tricks on me. I had to be overthinking it. I couldn't have been more wrong. The doorknob turned again. This time I bolted upright. Then, a knock. Light, almost hesitant. Knock, knock. Then, the doorknob again. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I texted my family, then Ryan, then Jake. I knew the chances of it being one of them were close to 0, but deep down I prayed. I prayed one of them would text back and say, "Yeah, it's me." Because if they didn't, I wasn't alone. My parents didn't answer when I called. They were supposed to be away until Monday, probably fast asleep in some hotel room miles away. I wasn't about to call out, "Who's there?" like some horror movie idiot. Instead, I slipped silently out of bed and crouched behind my dresser, gripping the heaviest object I could find. If whoever was out there decided to kick down the door, I wouldn't be caught off guard. I held my breath. Minutes passed. No more knocks, no more twisting doorknobs. Finally, I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. Whispering as quietly as I could while still making myself heard, I told the operator what was happening. She stayed on the line with me as I waited, every second stretching unbearably long. 911 operator, stay calm, officers are on their way. Can you stay on the line with me? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I whispered back, yes, I can stay on the line. I asked if the officers could meet me at my bedroom window. I wasn't about to step outside my room to see who or what was lurking in the house. A light tap at the glass, an officer. Relief flooded through me as I opened the window and handed him the key to the side door. Moments later, I heard my front door creak open. They were inside. Only then did I step out of my room, greeted by two officers. I flicked on every light in the apartment. It was small, barely any hiding places. The search downstairs took less than a minute. Then we went upstairs. As we moved through the main floor, I told them which room was which before they entered. Everything seemed untouched until they reached my parents' bedroom. A sudden commotion, shouting. I froze in the hallway as my stomach twisted into a knot. A single glance inside made my blood run cold. The officers were yelling at something. No, someone under my parents' bed. I was told to stay downstairs. I didn't argue. Minutes passed, each one stretching unbearably long. Then I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs. The officers were escorting a tall, filthy man out of the house. His sweatshirt was ragged, his shorts stained with dirt. His face, I'll never forget the way he looked at me. Like he hated me. Like he had been waiting for something. The police asked if I knew him. My voice came out hoarse. Of course not. Once he was gone, I finally breathed again. They told me if my family wanted to press charges, we could call the precinct. But when I called my parents in the morning, they decided against it. The guy was homeless. Nothing was stolen. But that wasn't what haunted me. What haunted me was the realization that I may have left the front door unlocked that night. Or worse, he had been inside long before I ever noticed. Something was watching me. I wasn't sure when it started. Maybe I had ignored the first few sounds, brushing them off as the usual noises of the woods. But when I really started paying attention, I realized the truth. I wasn't alone. It began with scratching. One night, while sitting out on my deck, I heard it, a faint, deliberate scrape against the side of the house. My heart pounded a little harder than usual, but I told myself it was just a squirrel. Still, something felt off. I went inside and locked up for the night. The next evening, it happened again, but this time, it was closer. The sound wasn't coming from the side of the house anymore. It was right outside the spare bedroom window. I froze, straining to hear past the silence. My nerves started to fray. I needed to see what was out there. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, just a sliver. Moonlight bathed the trees, casting eerie shadows across my yard. The wind was still, no movement, nothing. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. It's just my imagination, probably a branch scraping the glass or the wind playing tricks on me. I went to bed. The next night, it wasn't just scratching, it was tapping. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the window. My breath caught in my throat. My skin prickled. I jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and crept through the dark hallway toward the spare bedroom. My footsteps barely made a sound on the wooden floor. I reached the window. Clicking the flashlight on, I aimed it outside. Nothing. No movement. No footprints. Just the still, empty woods. But the air inside the room felt wrong, heavy, stale. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. For the next few nights, the sounds continued. A tap, a scratch, sometimes something even worse, a whisper. Faint, almost like it was coming from within the walls. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was all in my head. But the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. Finally, I decided to confront it. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon, a stray cat, something with an explanation. I grabbed a crowbar from the shed and headed to the spare bedroom. My hands were clammy as I reached for the doorknob. The air inside felt old, like the room hadn't been disturbed in months. I swept the flashlight across the space. Bed, dresser, empty corners, nothing. I exhaled, feeling like an idiot. But then I saw it, the closet door. It was slightly ajar. I never left it that way. My stomach dropped. I inched forward, every nerve in my body screaming, "Don't open it," but I had to. I pulled the door open. but in the back corner, caught on the edge of the wall, was a small, dark piece of cloth, torn, faded, like part of a shirt or jacket. My breath hitched, my mind raced. Had someone been in here? I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I stepped outside, gulping in the fresh night air. The woods pressed in around me, dark and endless. But I told myself it was all in my head. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. That night I slept on the couch, a baseball bat within reach. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. Almost too silent. The next night I tried to be brave. I refused to let whatever this was drive me out of my own home. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, tap, 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 I shot up in bed. My pulse pounded in my ears. This time, I ran to the spare bedroom, not caring how loud my footsteps were. I yanked back the curtain, and my breath caught in my throat. A shadow, not a tree, not an illusion, someone, standing just outside the window. I couldn't see a face, just a figure barely visible in the dim light. My body turned to ice, my mind spun. Who was that? What did they want? A sickening realization clawed its way into my brain. They had been watching me, maybe for days. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I dialed 911. The operator answered, but my voice came out in a hoarse whisper. Someone's outside my house, and I think they're still here. I gave them my address. They said help was on the way. Then I heard it. A slow creak, not outside, inside, from the hallway. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket, bolted for the back door, and flung it open. Then I ran. Through the woods, my lungs burning my legs, screaming at me to stop. I didn't. Not until I saw the flashing red and blue lights up ahead. The police stormed into the house, guns drawn. I didn't stick around to find out what they found. I didn't want to know. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. Whoever had been outside my house had been inside it too. I haven't been back since. After following up with the police to let them know I was safe, I made sure there wouldn't be a search for me. The cabin still sits there, isolated in the woods, but it no longer feels like home. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the tapping. I don't know who was in my house that night or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. They were waiting for me, and they're still out there. This all happened when I was about 15 years old, back in 2008. My parents had gone to the casino for the night, leaving me home alone with my dog, Abby. It was around 11 p.m., and I was up messaging friends on Instant Messenger while watching YouTube videos. Suddenly, Abby started barking from the living room. At first, I thought my parents had come home, but after a minute of barking with no sound of the door opening, I got up to check. Abby was standing by the window, staring outside, still barking. I peered out but could only see the single car in the driveway. My parents weren't home yet. I figured she might have heard a neighbor's car door or some other noise from the main road. Shrugging it off, I went back to chatting with my friends. But then I started hearing noises, faint at first, rustling, shifting sounds outside. Abby kept barking intermittently, reacting to something I couldn't see. Just as I was about to calm her down, I heard it. A knock. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I made my way back to the window, heart pounding. Nothing. The silence felt heavier than before. Then, another knock. But this time, from the side door. My breath hitched. Was it my parents? Someone trying to break in? Before I could process my thoughts, I heard the unmistakable sound of a doorknob rattling. But not just any doorknob, the one from the basement. Our basement door wasn't easy to find. It was hidden beneath the deck, accessible only if you knew exactly where to look. Whoever was down there was either incredibly determined or knew the house well. Abby went wild, barking and growling like I'd never heard before. The rattling turned into a heavier sound, like the door was being forced open. Then, suddenly, silence. Abby sprinted down the stairs. A part of me wanted to run after her, but fear rooted me in place. She let out a deep, guttural growl, a sound I'd never heard from my gentle black lab. Then, as abruptly as it started, I snapped into action. I called Abby upstairs, locked the basement door from the inside, and grabbed the home phone. I didn't have a cell phone yet. My hands were shaking as I rushed to my parents' room, where one of the house guns was stored. Huddled in the closet, I gripped the phone, ready to call 911. And then, the front door opened. Abby bolted out of the room, barking. My heart stopped, until I heard my parents' voices. Relief washed over me as I ran into the living room. They looked at me, confused, as Abby excitedly greeted them. Shaking, I recounted everything that had happened. My dad, face dark with anger, grabbed his gun and searched every inch of the house and yard, but he found nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. The next afternoon, there was a knock at the front door. My stomach twisted. I instinctively darted into another room as my dad answered. Standing outside was my Uncle Pete, holding an envelope. Uncle Pete had always given me an uneasy feeling. He wasn't outright dangerous as far as we knew, but he had a way about him, an unsettling presence that even adults picked up on. I'd always tried to avoid him at family gatherings.
I tried stopping by last night to drop this off, but no one was home, I guess.
I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but moments later the door slammed shut. My dad walked in, face taut with rage. He handed me the envelope. Inside was a card with a gift card, a thank you for helping his daughter, my cousin Kate, with her softball lessons. It was him. The entire night of terror, the knocking, the rattling basement door, the eerie silence, had been my creepy uncle. My dad made it clear during their conversation that Pete was no longer welcome around us. After that day, we never spent time with him again. Even now I still have so many questions. Why did he need to drop that off so late? Why didn't he just leave it in the mailbox? Why didn't he call to see if we were home? And most unsettling of all, what would have happened if he had actually gotten inside? If you've made it this far, I hope you're still breathing easy. Stories like these remind us that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the people we think we know. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales. And if you have your own creepy experiences, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, stay safe and keep your doors locked.